Hello, this is Joe Ty from Values Coach. And in this short webinar, I'm going to share with you a little bit about the history and some of the leadership lessons from one of the most amazing human beings who has ever lived on this planet, Florence Nightingale. Now, if you're in healthcare, you have no doubt heard of Florence Nightingale, the woman who more than any other person defined what it means to be a nurse and established nursing as a true and legitimate profession. She is also, more than any other person, has been the architect for the hospital as we know it today. So if you have ever been in a hospital, whether or not you're in healthcare, your life has been influenced by the legacy of this incredible woman. And to start our story, we need to go back to the year 1853. In that year, for reasons that have long since been forgotten by history, Great Britain and France and their ally Turkey decided that they had to have a war against Russia. Now, the British generals, as depicted in this cartoon of the era, had not been in a shooting war in more than 40 years. Not since Napoleon was vanquished by Wellington on the battlefield of Waterloo had the British Army even fired a shot in anger. And these British generals, full of arrogance and bombast, they forgot something about war. See, like politicians and generals so often do, they assured their people that our boys will be back by Christmas. The Russians won't put up much of a fight. And unfortunately for them, the Russians did put up much of a fight. And not only were the boys not back by Christmas, they were not back by the following Christmas or the Christmas thereafter. Something else that these generals forgot about war, and that is war creates casualties. And the casualties began to pile up in the Crimean War, and the British Army, in their arrogance, had not made any provision for the casualties that they thought would never happen. And literally these poor blokes who had taken a bullet for their queen began piling up on the beaches at Balaclava with inadequate, if any, medical care, no place to go. So the British Army went to their ally, Turkey, on the other side of the Black Sea from the Crimean Peninsula, and they asked, can you help us? Do you have a place where we can warehouse all these poor blokes who are sick and wounded and dying? And the Turkish government said, well, yes, we do. We have an abandoned army barracks building. Part of it's been burned out, but you can fix it up. It's called the Scutari Barracks, and you can use that as a place to warehouse all of these poor blokes. And warehouse is exactly what they did. These poor men, many of them died there. More than half of the soldiers who admitted in the first year died in this place, often after having had an arm or a leg or both amputated without anesthesia. They were, this is actually a drawing from somebody who was there. You know, they died on the floors. They were wearing the same uniforms they had been wearing on the battlefield days or even weeks earlier. The medical care was horrible. The mortality rate exceeded 50%. There was infection everywhere. The place, it turns out, had been built over a cesspool. It was infested with rats and lice and vermin. There were no medical supplies, pharmaceutical supplies. The men, when they got fed at all, whatever the officers wouldn't eat because it had gone rancid, got thrown into a big pot and boiled for the poor blokes. It was a general state of chaos. One eyewitness, the Reverend Sidney Osborne, who was there helping, wrote in his journal that the Scutari Barrack Hospital is a vast field of suffering and misery. And we think we have a healthcare crisis. And the British Army would have gotten away with it. They did back in Wellington's day. Wellington called the soldiers, the men who gave him his victories on the battlefield, he called them the scum of the earth, and that's the way they were treated. And they would have gotten away with it at Scutari, except for this man, William Howard Russell, the very first war correspondent. He was there, and he had a brand new technology, the telegraph, forerunner to Twitter. And he was sending reports back to London telling the people of London how their fathers and brothers and sons were being treated in this place, what Florence Nightingale, when she got there, called the Kingdom of Hell. And there was a general uprising, and people said, you have to do something. And in the entire British Empire, there was only one person who was prepared to do something about this catastrophe, and that was Florence Nightingale. A woman who by this time at the age of 38, she had spent her entire adult life studying hospital care and nursing care. And she recruited 38 other women, and they made the journey to Scutari. And she, as I said, she wrote home to her father and said, "This place is the kingdom of hell." But instead of throwing her hands up and giving up, this incredible woman rolled up her sleeves and she went to work. The first thing she did, something very basic, but she was the first person ever to think of it, she went around and numbered the beds so that every soldier had a bed number to correspond with his medical record. And in the next 2 years, she literally invented nursing as a profession, and she created a blueprint for the hospital as we know it today. She was the very first one ever to keep careful medical records on every patient, first one to go back and study those records later in the first ever hospital epidemiology project. She established the first hospital laundry and housekeeping and maintenance services. That's in the lower right, that's a picture of the laundry machine that they used, first one ever. In the process of doing those things, even though she did not, and very few people did, understand germ theory, first person ever to establish a formal infection control process, first hospital pharmacy, materials management. In fact, one of her biggest jobs, she said, was procurement of supplies. First patient library, first patient chapel. She was the first person ever to insist that in this hospital, medical triage would be on the basis of the patient's clinical condition and not their rank in the military, not their religion, not their social standing. In Victorian England, this was radical, this was revolutionary. The military brass fought her, the medical staff fought her. She stood her ground and she won and established a principle that should guide us ever since. She was the first person to understand the importance of the physical environment. She understood you open the windows and ventilate the place. You got to bring in heat. You got to put some art on the walls. You'll notice there's actually a painting hanging there. You got to keep it clean. You got to keep it quiet. She understood that the environment is an important part of the healing process. She was the first one to understand the essential element of nutrition in healing. She brought down one of the most famous chefs in England, Alexis Soyer, built him a kitchen and said, "Make healthy meals for my men." And he did. By the end of the Crimean War, the Angel of the Crimea was one of the most famous people in all of England, much more so than the generals who fought this disastrous war. In fact, on the upper left-hand side there, General Cardigan, undone at Balaclava in the infamous charge of the Light Brigade, juxtaposed with the Angel of the Crimea, who is saving all of those soldiers. By the end of the war, Mark Bostridge, in his landmark biography of Florence, by the end of the war, he said that the Scutari hospitals, and that's plural, there were several of them that she was responsible for, had been transformed from the kingdom of hell into an efficiently organized, smooth-running operation, all that in a 2-year period. Now, after the war, Florence Nightingale disappeared from public view, but her work was just beginning. She was a pioneer in using statistics to establish principles of public health. For her work in that field, she was made the first woman ever to become a fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, probably the only nurse who's ever been on the cover of a mathematics textbook. She invented the coxcomb diagram, a forerunner to the pie chart, to try to explain why was mortality so high at the Scutari Barrack Hospital and why did it fall so dramatically within such a short period of time. She was the first person ever to calculate cost per patient day in a hospital. She understood you have to run an effective, efficient, and productive operation if you want to provide empathetic and compassionate patient care. The very first professional school of nursing was established with her guidance. To this day, it still bears her name in London. She wrote 2 of the most influential books ever written in healthcare, Notes on Nursing, a book that inspired generations of women, mostly women, to become nurses, and the book Notes on Hospitals, which directed what hospital design and operation would be like for the next 100 years. St. Thomas Hospital in London, first hospital ever built specifically to be a hospital as opposed to taking an old building and retrofitting it. And it was designed based upon principles that Florence Nightingale outlined in her book. In the mid-1970s, I was the director of planning at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics. And at that time, we still had 2 open wards remaining from a building built in the 1930s. And those 2 wards still had 32 beds. Why 32 beds? Because in her book, Notes on Hospitals, that's what Florence Nightingale said was optimal for sanitation, ventilation, and communication. 100 years later, we were still following that incredible woman's blueprint. Florence Nightingale was by far the most effective advocate that veterans and soldiers have ever had for their health care rights. She spent her life fighting for health care for the veterans and for the participants in military service. In fact, the only known recording of her voice, recorded by Thomas Edison himself, was a plea for the citizens of London to support a veterans fund for the veterans of the Crimean War. As Mark Bostridge wrote in his biography, you don't have to look very far to see that the things Florence Nightingale was concerned about, those are things we're concerned about today too. We are still concerned about public health issues. We're still fighting to get people to wash their hands in hospitals the way she fought. We are still concerned about healthcare costs and the cost per patient day. We are still concerned about maintaining a quiet, clean, healthy environment for our patients. We are still concerned about being committed to professional education and development. All the things that inspired Florence are the things that should inspire us. And we desperately need to respark that spirit, that can-do commitment that Florence had at the Scutari Barrack Hospital, not just in our hospitals, but in our world generally. So let's look at some of the leadership lessons from this incredible woman. Leadership number 1. You will not be surprised that at Values Coach, we think this is number 1. You have to begin by being very clear about who you are, what you stand for, and what you won't stand for. And that is defined by a set of, as Beth Ulrich in her wonderful book, Leadership and Management, according to Florence, it begins with a set of values and principles that should guide everything you do, every decision you make, the way you establish relationships, and the way you work with the people that you serve. Number 2, leaders help us aspire to more. As Florence said, if nobody was discontented with what we have now, we'd still be hunting and gathering. The world would never become better. We have to reach higher. We have to aspire for more. Lesson number 3. Florence said, this is probably her most frequently quoted comment. She wrote in a letter to a friend of hers, I attribute my success to the fact that I never gave or took an excuse. She's talking about personal accountability, not the accountability of boss over subordinate, the accountability of someone holding your feet to the fire, but rather the accountability that comes from within, the willingness to walk across hot coals. And if you're willing to walk across hot coals, you don't have to have somebody looking over your shoulder and holding your feet to the fire. Lesson number 4, related to that, we take initiative. In her book, Suggestions for Thought, which was never published, she wrote, yes, indeed, the kingdom of heaven is within, but we also must create one without, because we have to be intentional about the good intentions that we have. We have to be committed to actually doing the work. As Barbara Dossi said in her wonderful biography, when doctors would say, we can't, Florence's response was, well, we must. And that's what she did. Lesson number 5. She understood that empathy is critical for quality patient care, but she also understood that empathy is essential for building solid relationships within the organization. As Florence Nightingale said, the most important practical lessons, they're not just learning how to be a good clinical nurse, they're not just learning how to be compassionate, but rather it is how to be empathetic, how to observe, how to acutely observe the environment and the individual. You see, 150 years before Daniel Goleman started to educate us about emotional intelligence and the all-important factor of empathy, which he calls social radar, Florence Nightingale understood how important empathy, that social radar, was. And she understood that one of the key responsibilities of the leader is to both earn and to give loyalty. As Gillian Gill wrote in her book Nightingales, after the Scutari barrack experience, after the Crimean War had ended, Florence Nightingale made it her mission to make sure that every single nurse who served with her had a way to get back home, and then she made sure that every single nurse was able to find employment somewhere else. And she did all that with no expectation of personal benefit. And as Mark Bostridge wrote in his book, she did the same thing for the soldiers. She showed that there was no limit on the length that she would take to serve the soldiers and later the veterans that she felt responsible for. And that picture is Florence Nightingale's funeral. And at her funeral, her coffin was escorted by octogenarian veterans of the Crimean War who 50 years later still remembered the lady with the lamp long after they had forgotten the names of the generals who led them into that disastrous war. She understood that leaders bring down silo walls. She said, no one nurse stands alone. And today she would say, no manager stands alone. No citizen stands alone. We have to learn to work together. And we have to inspire courage. She said, how very little can be done under the spirit of fear. You see, 150 years before Dr. Deming, the total quality management guru, made one of his 14 points of TQM, drive fear out of the workplace, Florence Nightingale understood that principle. You can't get things done in a spirit of high anxiety and intense fear. And she understood that leaders lead by example. As Gillian Gill wrote, she spent many hours in those horrible first days in that cold winter doing one-on-one nursing, and she chose to work in the most dangerous areas. She was not above getting down on her hands and knees and scrubbing the floor. There was nothing that she would not do. She did not need a job description or performance appraisals to put her all into the work. And a very important lesson today. Leaders do not tolerate toxic emotional negativity. You know, we hear so much about disrespect, disengagement, burnout, bullying, incivility, disrespectful behavior. And here's what she said about that more than 100 years ago in a letter to her nursing graduates. Backbiting, petty scandal, talking about people behind their back, bad thoughts, murmuring and complaining. And listen to this. Do we ever think that we bear the responsibility of all the harm we do to others and to our organizations in this way? And she would be absolutely appalled at seeing some of the headlines about bullying and incivility and metaphors like nurses eat their young in healthcare today. I put these words in Florence's mouth in my book, The Florence Prescription, but she absolutely would have agreed that one toxic negative person can suck the morale and productivity of an entire work unit the way one person lighting a cigarette instantly pollutes the lungs of everybody else in that work unit. And she would agree that it is a core leadership responsibility to promote a workplace environment that is positive and where toxic emotional negativity is not tolerated. And she would agree that the ultimate leadership lesson is proceed until apprehended. Empower yourself. Be responsible. Leadership does not require a management title. We all have that opportunity to step in, find something that needs to be done, and to do the work. She said, never lose an opportunity of a practical beginning, however small, for it is wonderful how often that mustard seed germinates and roots itself. And that's what we need to do today. We need to find a place where we can make a difference, be intentional about it, and do the work. And the Florence Challenge that we give hospitals and other organizations is 3 things. For people to make the commitment to be emotionally positive and self-empowered and fully engaged. Those are the 3 non-negotiable elements of a solid, positive, and productive culture of ownership. And if you go to the website, theflorencechallenge.com, click on the tab that says resources. There are a lot of things there. There's a leader guide, a study guide, but you can download this certificate of commitment, read it, sign it yourself, and post it where people can see it. And hold yourself and hold your colleagues up to that higher standard of being emotionally positive and self-empowered and fully engaged. Now, if you would like the advanced course on any of this, there are 2 books I'd recommend. My book, The Florence Prescription, From Accountability to Ownership. There are more than 500,000 copies of that book in print now, and it really is a manifesto for a more positive healthcare culture. It's a fictional story because Florence is actually a character in the book. And then more recently, my friend and colleague Bob Dent and I wrote Building a Culture of Ownership in Healthcare, published in March of 2017 by Sigma Theta Tau International, the Nursing Honor Society. And in that book, we share some of the most important lessons that we have learned about how do you build a culture of ownership. And this is really the essential thing for any organization. Having people who are thinking like an owner and not just renting a spot on the organization chart, who are thinking like partners in the enterprise and not just hired hands waiting for a paycheck. And if you do that, employee engagement and customer patient satisfaction goes up, safety goes up, you do a better job of retaining your best people and providing quality services in a highly productive way. So if you'd like to contact me, this is me. I'm Joe Tai, the CEO and head coach of Values Coach. I'm easy to reach. That's our telephone number, 319-624-3889. I am most easily reached because I travel so much by email, and that is joe@valuescoach.com. So I hope that you will think about these leadership lessons from this incredible woman and think about how they can be applied by you in your own life, in your family at home, and in your work, whatever work you do. Thank you, and as Florence would say, God bless.